The fluorescent lights of San Diego General's emergency room flickered at 3:17 in the morning when the doors exploded open and Maria Santos saw something that would shatter every boundary of her 8-year nursing career. A Navy SEAL, unconscious and drenched in blood, lay strapped to a gurney pushed by stone-faced men in tactical gear who said nothing, revealed nothing, only handed her a clipboard with redacted mission details. She counted the wounds as they transferred him to the trauma bay. 34 bullet holes riddled across his torso, arms and legs, like a roadmap of violence she couldn't comprehend. Dr. Patterson took one look at the vitals and shook his head, the universal signal among medical professionals that meant they were witnessing someone's final moments. Maria felt her grandmother's voice rise from somewhere deep in her memory, words spoken in Tagalog during her childhood about pressure points and energy flows that Western medicine dismissed as folklore. The SEAL's heart monitor screamed its warning as his pressure dropped to numbers incompatible with life, and everyone in that room began the slow, resigned choreography of recording a time of death. But Maria's hands moved faster than her doubt, pressing specific points along his ribcage in the ancient pattern Lola had made her practice on overripe mangoes in their Manila kitchen. His body convulsed once, violently, then his vitals climbed, slowly at first, then steadily, as the trauma team stared in bewildered silence at readings that defied every textbook they'd memorized. Dr. Patterson's eyes met Maria's with a mixture of suspicion and awe, but the chaos of stabilization swept away questions as they worked in frantic synchronization to close wounds and replace blood. The SEAL's eyelids fluttered open for just 3 seconds, long enough for his dilated pupils to lock onto Maria's face with desperate intensity. His cracked lips moved, forming numbers she barely heard over the machines. Coordinates whispered like a confession, followed by words that chilled her. Despite the room's oppressive heat, "They're coming for the truth," he breathed, his blood-stained hand gripping her wrist with surprising strength. Something primal in his expression, a raw plea that transcended language and protocol, made Maria commit those numbers to memory as his consciousness slipped away once more. She should have reported it immediately, should have documented every word in his chart, but instead she found herself standing frozen beside his bed, those coordinates burning in her mind like a secret she couldn't surrender. The coordinates haunted Maria through her remaining shift, like numbers carved into her consciousness. 17 degrees, 42 minutes north, 117 degrees, 13 minutes west, repeating in her mind as she mechanically documented patient vitals and changed IV bags. She scrubbed her hands 3 times after her shift ended, watching the SEAL's dried blood spiral down the drain while trying to convince herself that his whispered confession meant nothing, that traumatized. Men said incoherent things in their final moments of lucidity, but her grandmother's voice persisted in the silence of the locker room, reminding her that sometimes the universe chooses ordinary people for extraordinary burdens, and the weight of knowledge cannot be washed away like blood from skin. Maria changed into civilian clothes with trembling fingers, hyper-aware of the security cameras positioned throughout the hospital corridors, wondering if those lenses captured the moment she became complicit in something far beyond her understanding. The drive home through pre-dawn San Diego should have been routine, the same route she'd traveled thousands of times, but every pair of headlights in her rearview mirror felt like surveillance. Every dark sedan a potential threat she couldn't rationally explain. She parked outside her modest apartment complex and sat motionless in her Honda Civic, phone in hand, the non-emergency line ready to dial, her finger hovering over the numbers while her conscience waged war against itself. Report what he said. The logical part of her brain insisted. You're a mandatory reporter. You took an oath. You could lose everything for withholding information from a classified military case. Yet those coordinates felt less like random numbers and more like a sacred trust, a dying man's final act of faith placed in her hands, because Something in that trauma bay made him see her as an ally, rather than just another hospital employee processing his body through the system. Maria finally entered her apartment as orange light began bleeding across the horizon, transforming her familiar living room into something foreign and charged with possibility. She pulled out an old notebook from nursing school and wrote the coordinates on the inside back cover, disguising them among medication calculations and patient care formulas where they might hide in plain sight. The SEAL's words echoed through her exhaustion. They're coming for the truth, and she wondered who they were, what truth could be worth 34 bullets, and why. Fate had chosen a Filipino nurse working the graveyard shift to be the keeper of secrets that men killed to protect. Sleep came in fragments, filled with dreams of her grandmother's weathered hands teaching her pressure points while naval officers watched from shadows, and she woke 3 hours later to the sound of heavy footsteps approaching her. Iduza. The knock came precise and official, 3 measured strikes that shattered the morning quiet and sent Maria's heart racing before she even looked through the peephole. 2 figures stood outside in dark suits and credentials already raised toward the door, FBI badges gleaming in the hallway fluorescent light, and Maria knew with absolute certainty that her ordinary life had ended the moment that SEAL's blood touched her hands. She opened the door with manufactured calm, every instinct screaming that the coordinates hidden in her notebook had just become either her greatest liability or her only leverage, and the choice she made in the next few minutes would determine whether she'd protected a hero's final words or destroyed herself for a stranger's incomprehensible cause. The lead agent introduced himself as Special Agent Chen, his partner a stone-faced woman named Rodriguez, and they settled into Maria's small living room with the casual authority of people accustomed to extracting truth from uncomfortable silences. Chen's eyes catalogued every detail of her apartment, the framed photos of her family in Manila, the nursing textbooks stacked beside her second-hand couch, the rosary hanging near the door, as if her possessions might reveal secrets she hadn't yet spoken aloud. He explained that the SEAL, Lieutenant Commander James Mitchell, had been involved in a highly sensitive operation, and any communication he made while compromised could jeopardize national security, speaking in measured tones that felt both reassuring and threatening simultaneously. Maria's grandmother had taught her to read people through their hands, and she noticed how Chen's fingers remained perfectly still while his eyes never stopped moving, the contradiction of a man performing practice sincerity while calculating her vulnerabilities. Rodriguez leaned forward with manufactured warmth, explaining that Maria wasn't in trouble, that they simply needed to know if Mitchell said anything unusual during treatment, anything that seemed out of place or potentially classified in nature. The question hung in the air like smoke, and Maria felt the weight of the coordinates burning through her notebook in the bedroom. 17 numbers that separated her old life from whatever dangerous territory lay beyond this conversation. She heard herself saying that Mitchell was mostly incoherent, that she focused on stopping the bleeding rather than processing his words, technically true statements that felt like betrayal, even as they protected his final trust. Chen nodded slowly, but something flickered across his expression, disappointment or perhaps confirmation, and Maria realized with sudden clarity that this wasn't an information-gathering mission, but rather a test to determine what she knew and whether she'd become a problem requiring elimination. The agents exchanged a glance, weighted with unspoken communication, and Chen produced a tablet displaying surveillance footage from the hospital, grainy black and white images showing Maria leaning close to Mitchell's gurney, his lips moving near her ear. He asked her to reconsider, to understand that withholding information from federal investigators carried serious consequences, but also that full cooperation would be remembered and rewarded, the implicit threat and promise delivered with bureaucratic gentleness. Maria's pulse hammered against her throat as she watched her own face on that screen, frozen. In the moment of receiving secrets that men with badges now demanded she surrender, and she understood that Mitchell's desperate eyes had been warning her about people exactly like this. She repeated her statement about incoherent trauma speech, adding clinical details about blood loss and shock to give her lies medical credibility, while her mind raced through scenarios where she'd already made a fatal miscalculation. Chen stood with deliberate slowness, leaving a business card on her coffee table with numbers she suspected would route to somewhere far more sinister than FBI headquarters, instructing her to call immediately if she remembered anything else. Rodriguez paused at the door with a final warning disguised as friendly advice, mentioning that nurses who got involved in matters beyond their understanding sometimes found their work visas scrutinized, their family immigration applications mysteriously delayed, casual cruelty delivered with a smile that never reached her eyes. Maria closed the door behind them and stood frozen. In her entryway, listening to their footsteps fade while understanding that she'd just lied to federal agents about classified information, crossing a line that transformed her from innocent bystander into active participant in whatever conspiracy had put 34 bullets in a Navy SEAL. The coordinates in her notebook had become a bomb waiting to detonate, and she had perhaps 72 hours to decide whether to defuse it by confession or let it explode by discovery, gambling her entire future on the desperate trust of a dying man whose name she'd learned only minutes ago from people who might be the very enemies he'd warned her against. Maria waited until 3 in the morning before driving to the coordinates, her Honda Civic trembling through empty streets while paranoia transformed every pair of headlights behind her into potential surveillance. The address led to an industrial storage facility in National City, the kind of anonymous concrete complex where people hid divorces and bankruptcy, and she circled the block twice before parking 3 streets away, approaching on foot with her phone recording in her scrub pocket. Unit 217 sat in the back corner, secured with a combination lock that opened to the last 6 digits of the coordinates Mitchell had whispered, the mechanical click sounding impossibly loud in the pre-dawn silence. Inside, her flashlight beam revealed filing boxes stacked with military precision, and the first folder she opened contained shipping manifests for medical supplies to military bases. Except the quantities didn't match the destinations, phantom shipments that existed on paper but never reached wounded soldiers. Her hands shook as she photographed page after page, the clinical documentation of theft transforming into something far darker as she discovered logs of containers rerouted to private warehouses, initials beside each entry that repeated with damning regularity. One name appeared throughout the documents with the frequency of authorship: Colonel Douglas Reeve, the commanding officer Mitchell's medical. A chart had listed as his emergency contact the man who should have been at his bedside but had never appeared. The evidence painted a portrait of systematic corruption, military resources stolen and sold, while men like Mitchell bled for missions designed not to protect America but to eliminate anyone who noticed the holes in inventory reports. Maria found photographs paper-clipped to procurement orders, images of container yards and warehouse interiors, and in one shot she recognized Rodriguez, the supposed FBI agent from her apartment, shaking hands with men whose faces suggested violence was their primary profession. The final box contained something that stopped her breath. Entirely personnel files for Mitchell's entire unit, each stamped with red letters reading "compromised" and dated 3 days before his catastrophic mission. Someone had identified them as threats and marked them for elimination. Bureaucratic murder documented with forms and signatures, and Mitchell's file included a surveillance log that mentioned his friendship with a Filipino translator who'd disappeared 2 weeks earlier. Maria understood with sickening clarity that the 34 bullets hadn't been enemy fire, but fratricidal execution, a team sent into an ambush by commanders who decided loyalty to truth made them more dangerous than foreign adversaries. She photographed everything with mechanical precision, while tears blurred her vision, knowing that this storage unit was Mitchell's insurance policy, evidence he'd gathered while watching his brothers die, and he'd trusted her because he had literally no one else left alive to trust. Dawn was breaking when Maria finished, her phone now containing enough evidence to destroy careers and potentially trigger congressional investigations if she could survive long enough to deliver it. She drove home through morning traffic feeling the weight of invisible crosshairs, understanding that Mitchell had given her more than coordinates. He'd passed her a grenade with the pin already pulled, and the only question remaining was whether she'd throw it at his enemies or let it explode in her hands. Maria sat in her car outside the San Diego Tribune building for 20 minutes, watching the entrance while her phone felt radioactive in her lap, loaded with evidence that could either save lives or end hers. She'd chosen Marcus Chen, an investigative journalist, whose exposés on military contracting had won a Pulitzer 3 years earlier. Someone whose reputation suggested integrity in a world where she could no longer assume anyone's loyalty. When she finally entered the lobby, every security camera felt like an accusation, every person in business attire a potential threat, and she kept her thumb hovering over the delete button until Chen appeared, younger than his byline photo, with tired eyes that suggested he'd seen too many whistleblowers arrive desperate and leave disappeared. They met in a conference room with frosted glass, and Maria watched his expression transform from skeptical interest to horrified belief as she showed him photograph after photograph, his fingers occasionally reaching toward the screen before pulling back, as if the images themselves might be contagious with danger. Chen promised to verify the documents through his Pentagon sources to build a story that would be bulletproof before publication, but Maria saw something in his face that terrified her. More than Rodriguez's threats, the recognition that this evidence was probably worth killing for, and she'd just made herself expendable by sharing it. That night, working her ER shift felt like performing surgery while drowning, her hands steady on patients while her mind catalogued every unfamiliar face in the waiting room, every orderly she didn't immediately recognize. The call came during her break, her sister's number flashing on screen, and Lucia's voice arrived wrapped in panic, explaining that men had appeared at their parents' house in Manila asking questions about Maria. Strangers with American accents who knew where her nephew attended school, what time her father opened his repair shop, details that could only mean surveillance and implied harm. Maria's mother had gotten on the phone next, not asking what trouble her daughter had found, but simply saying in Tagalog, "We trust you, anak, do what's right." Words that broke something inside Maria's chest because her family was offering permission to endanger them for principles they didn't even understand. She stood in the hospital stairwell afterward, hyperventilating into her hands while the fluorescent lights buzzed judgment overhead, understanding that courage looked nothing like the movies promised. It was nausea and guilt, and the terrible mathematics of weighing your family's safety against strangers who'd die if corruption remained protected. Maria thought of Mitchell upstairs, still unconscious, his body a testament to what happened when good men threatened powerful systems, and she realized he'd given her these coordinates, knowing exactly what burden he was transferring, trusting that someone existed who valued justice more than survival. She pulled out her phone and texted Chen a single word: publish, then removed the battery and dropped it in the biohazard bin, a small death that felt like crossing a border from which no return existed. Walking back to the ER, Maria noticed a man in a dark suit watching from the corridor's end, his stillness among the hospital's chaos marking him as predator among prey. And she understood with crystalline clarity that her old life had just ended, replaced by something far more dangerous and possibly far more important. The next 72 hours blurred into a nightmare of looking over her shoulder, sleeping in colleagues' apartments, varying her route to work while watching for the surveillance she knew was there but couldn't quite identify. Chen called from a burner phone to say the story would run in 48 hours. that his editors were bringing in lawyers, that she should consider protective custody. Suggestions that sounded reasonable until Maria remembered Rodriguez's badge and realized protective custody might just be a cleaner way to disappear. She drove past her apartment twice without stopping, noticing the utility van that hadn't moved in 3 days. The man walking a dog at 2 in the morning on a street where no one owned pets. The infrastructure of watching that became visible once you knew to look for it. Maria was changing wound dressings on the 3rd floor when her supervisor found her, voice low and urgent, saying that the SEAL in room 412 had regained consciousness and was asking for her specifically, refusing to speak with doctors or the federal agent stationed outside his door until the Filipino nurse who'd saved him stood beside his bed. Her hands trembled as she walked down the corridor, past those same agents whose credentials she no longer trusted, their eyes tracking her movement with predatory attention that made her skin crawl. Mitchell looked smaller than she remembered, his powerful frame diminished by tubes and monitors, but his eyes were fully alert when she entered, burning with an intensity that suggested his mind had been awake long before his body cooperated, cataloguing threats and calculating survival while trapped in pharmaceutical darkness. He waited until she closed the door before speaking, his voice rough from intubation but carrying absolute certainty when he said her name wasn't on any official record of his care, that he'd checked his chart and seen how she'd documented his treatment under another nurse's credentials, protecting herself with an instinct that had probably saved her life. Maria felt tears burning because someone finally understood the impossible position she occupied, validated the paranoia that had transformed her existence into constant surveillance. And fear. Mitchell's hand reached for hers with surprising strength, and he told her what she'd already begun suspecting, that Commander Harrison, the man who'd planned their mission, had sent the team into an ambush because they'd discovered his involvement in a weapons smuggling operation that moved stolen military equipment through trafficking networks to insurgent groups. The mission brief had promised they were rescuing hostages, but they'd walked into a kill box designed to eliminate witnesses, and Mitchell had only survived by playing dead among his teammates' bodies until extraction arrived, then staying silent because he knew speaking meant immediate termination, medical or otherwise. The betrayal wasn't just Harrison, Mitchell continued, his words arriving in urgent bursts as pain medication wore thin and time ran short. The corruption reached into federal agencies, local law enforcement, politicians who'd been paid to look away, while American weapons killed American soldiers abroad. He'd gathered evidence for months. Before that final mission, documentation he'd hidden because he trusted no one in his chain of command, and he'd whispered those coordinates to Maria because her face held something his world had forgotten, a conscience that valued life over loyalty to compromised systems. Mitchell's monitor started beeping as his heart rate climbed, and Maria adjusted his IV while her mind processed the enormity of what he'd revealed, understanding that the evidence she'd already shared with Chen was just surface corruption, that the true cancer spread far deeper than anyone suspected. Then Mitchell said the words that changed everything, his voice dropping to barely audible as footsteps approached. Outside, telling her they needed to disappear now because the men in suits weren't there to protect him, but to finish what the ambush started, and he trusted only her to get them both out alive. Maria's nursing instincts shifted into pure survival mode as Mitchell's warning crystallized the danger they faced, and she found herself calculating impossible logistics, how to move a patient with fresh surgical wounds, multiple drainage tubes, and compromised mobility past armed federal agents without triggering immediate lockdown. She told Mitchell to stay calm while she checked the hallway, her mind racing through the hospital's layout, remembering the service corridors nurses used to transport deceased patients to the morgue, pathways designed to move bodies discreetly away from public view, and the bitter irony wasn't lost on her that their escape required mimicking death Through the door's window, she counted 3 agents in the corridor, their positions suggesting coordination rather than protection, and she recognized the shift change would happen in 17 minutes. That brief window when new personnel arrived and old assignments departed, creating chaos that might provide cover. Mitchell was already disconnecting his IV when she returned, his military training overriding pain as he stripped monitoring leads from his chest with practiced efficiency, and Maria grabbed a wheelchair from the supply closet while explaining they had one chance to reach the service elevator before security cameras flagged their movement. She dressed him in orderly scrubs she'd stolen from the locker room, covering his bandages with layers that transformed him from patient to staff, then wrapped his torso in additional gauze. She'd justify later as supply transport if questioned. The coordination required trust neither had time to build properly. Mitchell leaning his full weight against her small frame as they moved toward the door, Maria supporting him while projecting the casual confidence of a nurse helping a colleague who'd pulled a muscle during a difficult shift. She opened the door during the exact moment shift change announcements crackled through overhead speakers, and they moved into the hallway's fluorescent brightness as agents checked phones and compared notes, their attention fragmenting just enough. The walk to the service corridor lasted 30 seconds that stretched into eternity, each step requiring Mitchell to mask agony while Maria maintained cheerful conversation about fictional weekend plans, her voice steady despite terror liquefying her spine as they passed within arm's reach of men trained to kill. The service elevator doors opened like salvation, and Maria stabbed the basement button repeatedly as Mitchell's legs finally buckled, his weight collapsing against the wall as blood seeped through borrowed scrubs, spreading crimson evidence across fabric that moments ago had meant disguise, but now screamed their location to anyone who looked closely. She held pressure against his wounds while the elevator descended, knowing hospital security would review footage within. Minutes that their window for escape was already closing, and when those doors opened onto the basement's dim corridors, she was pushing Mitchell in the wheelchair toward the loading dock where laundry trucks made early morning pickups, toward freedom that felt more like falling. The safe house smelled of dust and forgotten cigarettes, a condemned apartment scheduled for demolition that Mitchell's former Marine buddy had kept off official records, and Maria cleaned his reopened wounds by flashlight while he leaned against peeling wallpaper, teeth clenched against pain he refused to vocalize. She worked with supplies stolen from the hospital, antiseptic, gauze, surgical tape, her hands steady despite exhaustion that made her vision blur, and Mitchell watched her with the intensity of someone reassessing everything he thought he knew about courage. When she finally finished wrapping fresh bandages around his torso, he spoke quietly about Ricardo Salazar, his last mission partner before everything went wrong, a force recon Marine from Manila who'd saved Mitchell's life in Yemen by carrying him 11 miles through enemy territory with a bullet in his own shoulder. The memory hung between them like a bridge connecting disparate worlds, and Mitchell's voice cracked slightly as he described how Ricardo had talked about his mother, who worked as a caregiver in Dubai, sending money home while raising siblings she'd never watched grow up, the same sacrifice Maria recognized in her own family's story. Maria sat against the opposite wall, knees drawn to chest, and admitted she'd sent her entire signing bonus back to Manila when her father needed emergency surgery, choosing extra shifts over sleep for 6 months straight. And something in Mitchell's expression shifted from gratitude to recognition, understanding that her decision to help him wasn't impulsive heroism, but fundamental architecture of who she'd been built to become. He confessed that Ricardo had died because Mitchell trusted the wrong intelligence, walked his partner into an ambush that command knew was compromised, and the guilt had been eating him alive until he'd started investigating the pattern of betrayals that led to his own team's massacre. They sat in silence as dawn light filtered through boarded windows, two people who shouldn't have survived their respective catastrophes, bound now by choices that had destroyed their normal lives while revealing what they were actually capable of enduring. Mitchell finally spoke the question that had been forming since the hospital. Would she help him finish what Ricardo died trying to expose? And Maria's answer came without hesitation, her voice steady with the same certainty that had made her memorize coordinates instead of forgetting them. The planning began immediately, Mitchell sketching organizational charts from memory, while Maria photographed documents with her phone, both understanding they were building either evidence for prosecution or their own obituaries, depending on who reached the information first. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, and neither mentioned that every passing hour decreased their odds of survival, focusing instead on the meticulous work of transforming tragedy into testimony, honoring the dead by refusing to join them quietly. Maria's uncle had served Senator Catherine Brennan 20 years ago in Manila, back when Brennan was a young consular officer who'd helped evacuate families during the eruption. And the connection felt solid enough to risk everything on a single phone call that Mitchell insisted on monitoring through a frequency scanner he'd assembled from electronics salvaged at a pawn shop. The senator agreed to meet them at a waterfront restaurant in Coronado, neutral territory, she claimed, though Mitchell's jaw tightened as he studied satellite images of the location, counting too many access points and insufficient cover, his tactical instincts screaming warnings that desperation forced them to ignore. They arrived separately, Maria through the front entrance wearing a borrowed dress that made her feel exposed, Mitchell circling through. The kitchen, after bribing a dishwasher with $300 and a story about surprising his girlfriend, both carrying phones loaded with evidence set to upload automatically if either device stopped receiving their hourly confirmation codes. Senator Brennan sat at a corner table with her back to the window, which Mitchell immediately recognized as the position someone takes when they're not worried about snipers, and Maria felt her stomach drop even before she noticed the way the other diners had gradually disappeared, replaced by men in casual clothes whose eyes tracked movement with professional precision. The senator's smile was warm, but her words cut like surgical steel. She thanked Maria for her patriotism, while explaining that the evidence needed proper channels, official custody, protective arrangements that required immediate surrender of all copies and devices, and Maria understood with devastating clarity that her uncle's old friend had either been compromised or never been trustworthy to begin with. Mitchell emerged from the kitchen corridor with his hands visible, phone held up like a talisman, and announced loudly enough for surrounding tables to hear that they were currently live streaming to 40,000 followers on a platform that saved data across distributed servers beyond any single government's reach. The restaurant erupted into controlled chaos as operatives moved to intercept them. But Mitchell had planned for exactly this betrayal, and Maria grabbed the senator's water glass, fingerprints and DNA that would prove her presence, while Mitchell overturned their table to create momentary barrier. They ran toward the kitchen as the live stream counter climbed 60,000 viewers, 80,000. Maria narrating breathlessly into her phone about coordinates and trafficking networks while Mitchell provided cover, and bullets shattered wine bottles behind them as they crashed through the service exit into blinding sunlight. A motorcycle waited where Mitchell's Marine buddy had promised, engine running, and they accelerated into traffic while Maria held both phones high, still streaming, watching the viewer count explode past 200,000 as the truth they'd protected with their lives became too viral to suppress, too distributed to destroy, amplified by strangers who would never know how close it came to dying in a waterfront restaurant that smelled of gunpowder and betrayed hope. The phones kept recording until they reached the naval base gates, where Mitchell surrendered to shore patrol he'd personally served with, gambling that public attention and military protocol would provide more protection than running, and Maria's hands shook so badly she could barely stop the stream, her voice hoarse as she told viewers to save everything, share everything, remember everything, transforming her terror into testimony that would outlive whatever happened next. 6 months dissolved like morphine through an IV, the investigation consuming headlines until the arrests became routine and the corruption trials transformed into background noise that most people scrolled past without reading. But Maria remembered every testimony, every conviction, watching from her apartment as the network Mitchell had died to expose finally crumbled into federal custody. She'd returned to the emergency room at Mercy General after the dust settled, finding strange comfort in the familiar chaos of trauma bays and cardiac arrests, though her colleagues treated her differently now, some with admiration, others with the careful distance people maintain around those who've touched something dangerous and survived. The night shift became her sanctuary again, 12-hour stretches where she could focus on wounds she understood how to heal. Bleeding she could actually stop, until the evening a man in dress blues appeared at the nurse's station asking specifically for Maria Santos, and her heart seized with the irrational fear that it was starting again. Mitchell stood straighter than she remembered, the coma weight gone from his face, replaced by the carved fitness of someone who'd rebuilt himself through punishing discipline and unfinished business that wouldn't let him rest. His wife stood beside him, holding a daughter maybe 6 years old, who clutched a drawing of a nurse with angel wings, and his teenage son wore a Navy Junior ROTC uniform that made Maria's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Mitchell's voice carried the same controlled intensity she remembered from the safe house, but his words reshaped everything they'd survived. He'd established a foundation named after her grandmother, Lola Rosa's legacy, dedicated to bringing Filipino nurses to American hospitals while protecting healthcare workers who reported corruption, transforming her single act of defiance into infrastructure that would outlive them both. The little girl presented her drawing with ceremony, explaining that her daddy said Miss Maria was the bravest person he'd ever met. Braver than all the SEALs combined because she'd chosen courage without any training to prepare her. Maria knelt to accept the drawing, tears blurring the careful crayon work, thinking about her own family back in Manila who could finally sleep without fear, about the nurses who would follow the path she'd accidentally cleared. Mitchell's hand on her shoulder carried the weight of everything unspoken. The coordinates whispered in delirium, the evidence that almost died with them, the live stream that turned witnesses into weapons, and she understood that some bonds transcend gratitude, forged instead in the specific heat of shared terror and unlikely survival. The emergency room continued its controlled chaos around them, ambulances arriving with fresh crises, but for one perfect moment, Maria let herself feel the victory they'd stolen from. Impossible odds. His family stayed for an hour, long enough for Maria to teach his daughter how nurses count heartbeats, long enough for Mitchell to promise this wasn't goodbye, but the beginning of work that would need her voice, her story, her continued courage whenever she could spare it. They left as the sun set over San Diego, and Maria returned to her patients carrying something lighter than hope. The concrete knowledge that one person's refusal to look away could genuinely change which stories get buried and which ones survive to become someone else's foundation, someone else's chance, someone else's unexpected redemption in a world that desperately needs people brave enough to risk everything for strangers who can't protect themselves. Would you have had the courage to memorize those coordinates, or would fear have made you forget? Subscribe to witness more stories where ordinary people face impossible choices that change everything.